So it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see such a wonderful turnout. I can't usually do two things at once, so let's see how this goes. All right, not so bad. So I wanted to start with this photo. And this, in fact, is not Peter Neskrecki, despite the subtitle at the bottom. It is a photo by Peter. But this is what Peter looks like, or at least it's what he looked like as a small boy. He looks more like this now, and he pretty much typically has some sort of katydid, cricket, or grasshopper close to his face most of the time. But I wanted to show him as a small boy, in part because one of the questions I want to deal with today is for children growing up today, for little boys and little girls who might go on to be scientists or just interested citizens. I think there's a real question about what's left to discover. And there are a variety of reasons we might think that the answer would be not so much in the biological world. We've sunk flags in the South Pole and the North Pole. We've chipped golf balls off the moon. And we've left many of the landscapes in the living world looking like this, with the forest chopped up into little bits and the wild pieces of the world rendered back. And so in a landscape like this, it's easy to believe that what is left is to explain details, to go back to these bits of the wild landscape and to document what once was. And this is the kind of question that lots of us as scientists struggle with. It's the kind of question as a graduate student I particularly struggled with. I worked in tropical landscapes. And so I had this real sense of wanting to know what was left for me to find. And I thought I'd put this in the context of Darwin, given this is the year of Darwin, but it's this more general question of what really is left to know. And I like these old maps in many senses, but in one sense in that they make clear that the unknown can be a geographical space, that we can think about and try to measure the unknown. And so on this old map, you can see here at the bottom that this whole area is called the Austral Unknown Land. And so we knew there was a big something down there. We didn't know quite where it was or quite how big it was. And so in the same way, there's a kind of unknown biologically today. It's not a geographic space. It's sort of a space of living things that we might discover. And so the question I want to get to today, sort of circularly, coming back to it again and again through some stories, is how big that realm is. What does this unknown terra look like? And there are three sorts of narratives that have influenced how I think about this unknown land. And one begins with this kind of unlikely character. This is Oliver Zampro. And at this point in the story, he was a graduate student in Germany. And what he was supposed to be doing was looking at grasshoppers and stick insects to try to find some new species and organize them in a systematic way. But like all graduate students, he got bored with his main project and wanted to do some other things. And so he was looking through the sort of odd drawers of life. And if you go to any museum like this one, the things that the public sees are these neatly ordered cabinets filled with life from different parts of the world. But when you go in the back, there are those neatly ordered cabinets, like our nicely ordered kitchen drawers, which I don't have too many of. But then there are also these odds and ends drawers of life, where things aren't organized well. And in these odds and ends drawers, you can find all sorts of things. So you can find those pliers you were looking for. You can also find a lot of garbage. And so Zampro was looking through one of these drawers that he might find something kind of interesting. And he did. He found this fossil insect that didn't quite look like anything he'd seen before. And he knew the things that were kind of like this. And so he could tell this was unknown. This was part of that unknown land. And so he went back up to his advisor, and they talked about it, and he eventually came to think that maybe it was a whole new order of life. It was like not knowing that primates exist, having found them in the basement. And that was a fossil order, and so something from a faraway realm in terms of time, but still really exciting. And so they sent out letters and made phone calls and sent some emails to see if anybody else had seen this thing. And long story short, somebody came back with a positive answer. Yes, they'd seen it. But the interesting thing was, it wasn't a fossil. They'd found it on a pin in a specimen drawer in another museum, which meant that somebody had collected it alive someplace in the world. And so the next thing they did was to look at that little death certificate that's associated with every pinned insect, that tells where it was found, the time of death, all that sort of stuff. They don't have toes, and so you put them underneath them. And that death certificate had some good news, which was that this strange thing had been found in a very remote place in Namibia, down here. And within Namibia, a particularly remote place, the Brandberg Massif, which is this giant granite plug that sort of rises out of the landscape. And it's granite where everything that was around it wore away. And so it's kind of this just flat rock plateau. And so if you wanted to find a forgotten land where you might still have this strange order no one had ever seen before, this was the place. The bad news was Zampro was a broke graduate student, and the odds of getting to the remotest Namibia seemed remote as well. But he was able to convince Conservation International to fund a trip to look for this. And it took a lot of money, and it was a big expenditure for Conservation International. And everybody wanted to go find this thing, and so it was expensive too because everybody kept tagging along, including my buddy Peter, which is how I came to know about this story. Because I was a graduate student, I shared an office with Peter, and he came back after he got a job to tell me about this discovery. And so they went out to the field with these pictures of this strange insect and talked to people. But then they also flew in a helicopter out to the Brandberg Massif. And they brought lots of stuff. They brought food and cameras and all kinds of gear. And they get out there, and when Peter gives this talk, he cuts off the porters so it looks like they're carrying all their own gear. But they're, in fact, in the front there. And so they get there, and this is what the landscape looks like, a kind of desert. When you talk about looking for a needle in a haystack, this is looking for a tiny, maybe extinct bug in the middle of a giant desert that looks like this, and this, and that, and not very hopeful in general. And an ordinary person would come home probably at this point, but these were entomologists, and so they stayed, and they found them. They first found one species, and then they found another. And in some places, they were quite abundant. And so they came home. But en route to coming home, they had to walk out. And they had brought too much stuff, and they weren't all in good shape. And so in the process of walking out, had to start throwing away gear, including cameras, including clothes, including food, but damn sure not including any of those bugs. And so they get home and they publish a fancy paper about this, and everybody's very excited. And with every systematic description of a new group, you have to give it a kind of driver's license, how you're going to know it again if you find it again. And for insects, this usually includes portraying its genitals. So here we have recorded for posterity, the new order's privates. Just how it is. And then a funny thing happened. People saw these pictures, and what Zampro had expected is they would say, look how strange that is. I've never seen it before. But instead, people all over Africa said, look how familiar that is. And it turned out that this thing wasn't just in the Brandberg Massif, that it was found in several places in Africa, up into Turkey, and even in abandoned lots in Cape Town. And so here, this new order of life, this branch on the tree of life, this big discovery, it could have been made by a high schooler in Cape Town who was persistent enough to try to figure out what the heck this was. Persistent enough to ask people until somebody said, I don't know. Until he or she then sent it off to somebody who might. It was right there. All you had to do was to know that it was unknown and to know it was possible for something this unknown to be anywhere. And so this was my first kind of discovery as I was beginning to think about this question of what's unknown. And I should say that my book's now called Every Living Thing, but it was originally called Unknown because of this essence of this question I was trying to get at, what's unknown. But it went off to the publisher with the cover page saying title : unknown, and they promptly sent me back a sort of snarky email saying that when are you going to finally decide on a title? And so that had to go, but for me it's still unknown. I haven't decided. But this is the first story, because here's the story about how unknown things can be everywhere, and we just have to acknowledge that we're ignorant enough that they could be in our backyard. The second narrative, the second element that became important to me was the story of what indigenous peoples all around the world know about their surroundings, which is to say a great deal. Indigenous peoples all around the world, traditional people living the way that all of us, our ancestors, used to live, often know hundreds of plant species where there are hundreds. They know hundreds of insect species. They've named all these things. And so that's interesting in and of itself, but it's particularly interesting if you think about it in the context of human migration. So you imagine we all came out of Africa at some point and moved around the world. And when we think about this story, we usually picture some stern-looking, stereotyped Native American. But as I think about this expedition and who actually would have done it, it's way more likely to be somebody like your crazy uncle, somebody who's at the edge of the community going, hey, it'd be great, let's go over the hill and see what's there. And so it turns out if you Google image crazy uncle, this guy turns up. I hope he's not in the audience, but so crazy uncle's going over the hill. And this is happening all over the world. And it's not just like it's more of the same, because you're coming up out of a dry ecosystem into temperate forests. You're coming down out of temperate forests into jungle. And so suddenly you're finding all these species you've never, ever seen before. And that's great if you're on an ecotourism trip. But if you've got to find a way to eat and not eat something poisonous and not be killed by a snake, you've got to know to name them. You've got to be able to tell. Crazy uncle has got to be able to tell whoever this poor kid is, don't eat this berry. Something bad happened to me. And for that, we have to know. We have to learn about our world. And so this quest to learn about the world, to understand the unknown around us, is ancient. It's a kind of primitive quest. It's an urge, even, to understand our world. And so this is the second part of this narrative that helped me understand what's unknown, that this idea that we're trying to lay hold of the biological world is old. It's a big part of who we are. And the third part was the realization as I went back through the big discoveries in the history of biology. They depend almost exclusively on individual scientists, on the firing of a few neurons that somehow allow an insight that we wouldn't have had otherwise. An insight that transforms how we see the living world in a way that we never see it quite the same way again. And you imagine these as sort of faraway scientists in lab coats, but these are individual humans with all the same struggles we have. They're just people with the same, they're just humans, and that these humans can lay hold of the world and somehow transform what we know is an amazing story. And so for me to link these stories of the individual humans laying hold of the world, of this primitive quest to know the world, and of the fact that still there's so much unknown, was how I started to think about this question of what still remains to be unknown. And so what I want to do now is sort of circle through some of these stories of these individual scientists and their firing neurons and what they revealed, starting with a few historical discoveries and moving to some more recent discoveries. This is a painting by Vermeer, and it's called The Geographer, and it's often thought of as a painting of van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch tailor, let's say, and draper. And Leeuwenhoek and Vermeer both lived in Delft, and they may or may not have known each other. This may not actually be a painting of him, but let's pretend it is for right now. It's been suggested as much. Leeuwenhoek at some point in his life came across a microscope, unclear exactly how, but when he did, he was fascinated with it. And he began to look at the world around him. And if he were Vermeer, he'd probably be looking at the girl with the pearl earring. But he wasn't, and so he looked at every other thing in his world. He probably would have looked at the mouth of the girl with the pearl earring. Because when he looked through the microscope, he saw all these things nobody seemed to have told him about before. He wasn't a scientist. He'd done some kinds of physics experiments, but high school or middle school sort of science fair sorts of things. I mean, it wasn't big science. And yet he was seeing these things. No one seemed to know about them. And so he eventually drafted a letter to the Royal Society in London to tell them, look, I saw all this stuff. Have you guys seen it before? And they greeted it in the mode that you might greet a Nigerian money order scam initially. But it had all these observations that were kind of intriguing. And so Robert Hooke at the Royal Society and others started to look through microscopes to see if they could see what he saw. And eventually they began to. And they eventually began to realize he was seeing this world nobody had seen before. But for whatever reason, instead of looking back at that world themselves, they wrote him more letters and said, hey, Anton, would you look at this? And so he did. And when he started using the microscope, he was 40 years old. So his life expectancy was probably another 10 years maximum. But he lived to be almost 100. And so throughout his entire life, for almost every waking hour, he looked through these little microscopes at the world. He looked at his mouth, he looked at his neighbor's mouth, he looked at his poop, his neighbor's poop. He looked at pepper, all his foods, his gutters. He looked at his neighbor's sperm. I mean, he looked at everything. And in doing so, he opened up a kind of door to this magical world that I would argue, until 5 years ago, nobody saw in the same way as Leeuwenhoek. Nobody saw with the same intensity and wonder that he saw it with in the 1600s. He had really discovered something, and he had done it not through some ferocious insight, not through genius, through persistence, through the belief that if he kept looking, he could see more. And so, for him, the microbial world, the small world, came to be a kind of universe. And so I would argue that what he saw and what he ushered in was a kind of slow Copernican revolution that I'll come back to suggest was actually, we're just still turning the wheel. But he essentially moved humans from being the only thing in the room to being part of a wild biosphere of life in the room. He took us away from being central. We didn't all listen. The second character I want to talk to you about is Linnaeus. And Linnaeus is a very different kind of discoverer from Leeuwenhoek. Linnaeus comes into the world 80 or so years later, and he's interested in plants primarily. And he comes into the world at a time of great biological turmoil. And so I want to read to you a little bit quickly about Linnaeus. On the morning of Friday, May 12th, 1732, Linnaeus left Uppsala. It was his birthday. The horse sighed under the weight and then stumbled forward, but the going was slow. Not far from his starting point, Linnaeus got off his mount and pulled out his writing pad. He'd seen a flower on the ground and then something yellowish and intriguing. A little further on, he stopped and got down again. He'd make thousands more such stops. He was like most biologists, a difficult travel companion. My wife, who's outside, back there somewhere, can vouch for this. A trip that should have taken a day would take 3, another flower, and then another, and then a bird, and then a beetle called his attention. If the horse could have talked, it might have mentioned they still had a long way to go. On this particular day, at the beginning of this journey, financed by the Royal Academy of Sciences, the Swedish one, Linnaeus' horse was listless and ready to move on. Later in the journey, Linnaeus would describe himself as having had barely a pen, a change of clothes, a plant press, and a wig, which is not true. He looked more like that, but covered in stuff. But who have seen him then, it would have been clear that he had brought much more, too much, in fact, for he'd also taken with him, among other things, books of ornithology and plant biology. The trip would come to mark the beginning of an age of discovery, grander than the discovery of the New World. He was to go from Uppsala in the south north along the Gulf of Bothnia on relatively well-trodden trails until reaching Umeå. From Umeå, the journey would travel inland, toward the Arctic Circle and the mysterious land of the Sami. Although northern Sweden does not now seem like a far and untrammeled realm, in 1732 it was, by Linnaeus' accounts, the most barbaric tract in the whole world. Well, he was lying. It wasn't barbaric at all. And it would come to be the beginning of lots of tall tales from Linnaeus about his own ardors. But so he went up on this trip, and he saw all these wonderful things and started to name them and realized he could name things people hadn't named before. And he became obsessed with that. Not unlike the way that Leeuwenhoek had become obsessed, but with a very different thing. He became obsessed more with his own power to call out the names of things. So it was as if he'd found Babel. If I can pull that quote easy. Where they said, "Look, they are one people and they all have one language. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language. The confusion to the language of science was in fact at this time that so many plants and animals were coming back to places like Sweden. Even as he began his trip, he was going to collect a few species, but hundreds were coming back from all over the world. And so things were getting named again and again in different languages. Even in Latin, things would have longer and longer names to describe them, more and more adjectives. But it wasn't clear if one thing that was named in Sweden, in Latin, by one person was the same as a thing named in England. It was as if the whole language of science was about to be disassembled. And what it needed for that not to be the case was really for someone to unite all of the names of the things in the living world. Which, looking back in history, it seems possible that that might not have happened. Because it required almost inevitably a kind of arrogance to say that your system is right and you're going to name all the things in your system with your names, and you're the one. But Linnaeus had that kind of arrogance. He was just right for this job. He was a kind of anti-hero. He was totally unlikable. He was the only person I wrote about in the book that I just couldn't imagine being with for very long. And yet what he did was amazing. Among the things that sort of feed into that arrogance he had, when he went to the field, he had somebody walk in front of him drumming a drum to announce the coming of Linnaeus. I can't even get my students to whistle. And so he came back from this trip and started to organize what he had collected, but also started to name things more generally, and very quickly became very ambitious. And it was written about him that even from a humble cottage, a great man may emerge. And this was written early about him. Of course, it was written by him. But still. And yet somehow, despite this personality, what he was able to do was to produce a common language for science. He developed, somewhat accidentally, the genus and species system. We're all Homo sapiens because of Linnaeus. Genus Homo, species sapiens. That was his field system for his apostles, which is what he called his students, which of course made him their god, to use in the field. And it caught on, and so he kept pushing it. And in fact, in his lifetime, almost all of the plants and animals that had already been named were renamed using his system. And so he got credit not only for things he found, but things for people had found 100 years before. And so if you go outside and look at the common species, the dogs, the cats, the rats, they're named by Linnaeus because he got those things. But he thought he was going to get everything, and it turned out he wouldn't. But his system is still this system we use today. And so even though it's a tool, what he developed, it's a kind of discovery. It's a kind of way of changing how we see the world. And this is one of his cabinets in which he put his plants. And so this is where the order of life started. Linnaeus said that God created, Linnaeus ordered. And it's true in the sense, well, not the God part, but the Linnaeus part, which he ordered life. And we still use that system. It's noteworthy that he didn't ever always get things right. All of the microbes that Leeuwenhoek had discovered went into one species, Chaos infusoria, and stayed there for a while. And now I want to turn to some more recent discoveries. And to me, the thing about these more recent discoveries that have happened for the most part since I was born, is that they look very much like these earlier discoveries. The hats are different, but otherwise they have lots of similarities. And so I'm going to start reading here again just for a second. In the summer of 1912, not far from their house in the French Pyrenees, 3 boys found a cave. They were experienced at exploring in their free hours, and so they proceeded inside. As they entered the cave, they came to a small cliff, which they climbed until they reached a wide cave gallery. Within the gallery, they found a passage that left the cave like a chimney. It was so cramped that on his own, each boy might have judged it too dangerous to enter and explore. The chimney tunnel extended further in its narrowness than they might have hoped. The reasonable response would have been to turn back, yet they pressed deeper. Their shoulders and chest grew tight, so that at times it was difficult to breathe. They climbed until they arrived at a place where the stalactites blocked their progress. Again, they might have stopped, but they were boys, and they could see something on the other side, some farther chamber, and so they chipped at one of the pillars and then made their way through. As the anthropologist Lawrence Robbins wrote of what happened next, they slipped into the unknown, entering a part of the cave that was last seen by humans in the Ice Age. The tunnel opened into an enormous cave. The boys were sweaty, exhilarated, and happy to have come through intact. Soon they were speechless, beyond excitement. They could not see well, but in the sweep of their lights they found the claw marks of cave bears, bones of large animals, and then footprints that they would later learn were more than 10,000 years old. Then farther down the cave, they saw what was to be their biggest discovery. 4 upright clay bison, each the size of a small dog and more than 15,000 years old, pointed as though ready to charge. The boys stood silent. Eventually, they climbed back down through the tunnel and told the world. This is how we imagine science. We climb through a hole into a new chamber of the world, laugh, weep, and then the journalists call. What the biologist Lynn Margulis, now at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, would come to believe she had discovered was not unlike a cave filled with ancient art. It was a set of signs written within a cell's wall. She read them and understood. She came out of her cave and announced her finding. Then things departed from the script. No one believed her. What Margulis did at a very young age, and this is Margulis when she was in college. She went to college at the age of 16. Met Carl Sagan in college, who was then 19. They married not too long after. What she did was to look at things other people had seen, including Chlamydomonas, which is this creature right here. And she noticed things, and she noticed them that she describes it as the way you might notice things in a poem, like you're reading literature and trying to critique the literature and understand it better. She saw that in this Chlamydomonas that the green organ of photosynthesis, the same organ that offers photosynthesis to all green matter on life, the chloroplast, that it did things that were kind of like a bacteria would do. It divided on its own. There was recent evidence that it had its own DNA. It kind of looked like a bacteria. And so she had this wild idea. Other people had kind of talked about it before, and much earlier people had advanced something similar, but 100 years earlier. But she had the idea that maybe it was a separate life form that had been engulfed, and it was kind of a life within a life. Now, this is a ridiculous idea, really, you'll have to admit. Think about it with your own body, that a squirrel crawls into you. You eat a squirrel, it comes back to life in your stomach, and suddenly it lives with you for the rest of your life and divides in your gut. It's silly. And so is this. And she then made her idea bigger. She thought, what about mitochondria, those powerhouses of all of our cells? What if they had that same history? They were also microbes that had been engulfed. Again, ridiculous, a squirrel in your gut. And then she said, what if all of the really big events in the history of life were these kinds of joinings, the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup events of evolution, the coming together of two lineages to produce something that does better somehow. And then she looked around, and there were nodules in rhizobia that were the union of bacteria and plants, like legumes, that helped those legumes do better than they would otherwise, and the bacteria. There were the guts of termites, which have as many lineages as you might find in some forests, living in their guts, on which they depend obligately. Cook the microbes out, and the termites will die. They need them to feed. And then later there would be the deep sea vents, where the tube worms depend on microbes for their sustenance and couldn't live there otherwise. And so with the green plants, with these little squirrel creatures in them, and all these other things with their own little creatures, it was as though the entire series of events that lead to the big biomes of life were these joinings. It was ludicrous, except that it was right. And it would take years for people to give her full credit for this idea that others would come to talk about, but that she advanced most strongly. That she advanced even when people told her that she was definitely wrong, most assuredly wrong, that she was ridiculous. William Culberson, a professor of botany at Duke University at the time, wrote that when he was an undergraduate, 2 theories were held up for ridicule to show how far-fetched scientific theories can get. One was the theory of continental drift, and the other was the symbiotic theory of the origin of the cell. So we all move west on this continent, and we all have mitochondria in our cells that have a history separate from the outside of the cell. And that was discovered during most of our own lifetimes. More recently, this guy, Carl Woese, was working in his lab, and he decided that he thought he could look at the evolutionary history of all of life, not just the mammals and the birds, but everything, that he could look at the base of the evolutionary tree, maybe all the way back if he squinted to the origin of life. And he would do it with this new RNA method that nobody had used before. And so he went into his lab, closed the door, and proceeded to work on this for years. Without a major publication on this approach, without any support from anyone. And finally, somebody else from the same department offered him another kind of microbe. Maybe look at this, Carl. Shake yourself out of whatever you're doing because it's not leading to progress. Just look at this microbe I found. It's a methanogen. Maybe it's kind of different. Maybe it'll be interesting in your whole evolutionary tree thing. And so he looked at it, and it was not just a little bit different. He came out of his office walking fast, as he tells it, and announced that he'd found a new branch in the tree of life, a new kingdom, he initially said. That he was reorganizing this very base of Darwin's tree, he thought. And now if you remember in your high school textbooks or college textbooks or anywhere you may have looked, unless you went to school very, very recently, these are the kingdoms of life you would have seen. The plants, the fungi, the animals, the protists, and the monera are bacteria. And this I actually pulled from the web from my high school education page today. What Woese was arguing, first in the New York Times and only later in a peer-reviewed publication, was that all of the things on the top, the plants, the fungi, the animals, and the protists were all one branch of life, that the bacteria were another big branch, and that he, after all these years, by himself in his lab, had discovered the other big branch in a methanogen, a cow fart bacteria. People ridiculed him. They told his friends to stop working with him. And of course, again, in this case, he's right. He magically pulls from his fingers this new tree of life that we now think of as mostly dogma. The bacteria, the eukarya, and the archaea. The archaea being what he, in that endeavor, discovered. But he also discovered this approach of looking at the tree of life through looking at RNA, and then eventually DNA would follow. And so the thing that this does is, like Leeuwenhoek, it pushes us further to the margins. It makes our branch of the tree of life less important. It puts us out there with the plants and fungi, marginal relative to what is most of life, these microbes. His work also allowed the best test of Lynn Margulis's work, because it allowed her to build a tree of life, which showed that the base of the tree of life was, in fact, quite messy. And we could see the bacterial lineages that would give rise to chloroplasts shifting across the tree. We could see the bacteria that gave rise to mitochondria shifting across the tree. And so together, although they don't like each other at all, they would come to this great insight. And then more recently, William Parker, who's working at the Duke Medical Center, an assistant professor there, was looking at this antibody that's very common in all of us, and had been thought for a long, long time to have a primary function of attacking microbes in our guts. Except the details didn't match. It didn't seem like that totally fit the story, because it almost seemed like some of the bacteria benefited when there was more of this IgA. And so it just wasn't right. And so some neurons fired. And collaborators were involved, and the ideas came around. And Parker has now offered that instead what's going on is that this IgA is actually signaling to the bacteria and helping them to form biofilms and to hang out in our guts, helping them to be symbiotic with us, much like those squirrels in those early cells, those mitochondria and chloroplasts were inside our cells. This has received now a fair bit of support. A fundamental change in the last few years of how we view a major antibody in our own bodies, not some faraway jungle discovery. And it leads to something even more interesting, I think. How many of you have had your appendix out? Yeah, a reasonable number. So what's the appendix do? Nothing, right? It's what we're all taught.
It comes out.
Yeah, it comes out. Yeah. It gets thrown in the garbage. But it turns out nobody looked at the appendix very well. There aren't a ton of studies of the evolution of the appendix. And if you read textbooks, they all say, well, other primates probably used it for something, and then it became vestigial in us, and so it grew smaller. But when you actually look at the other primates, the appendix in other primates is not always smaller, or not always bigger. In fact, sometimes it's smaller. We seem to have a bigger appendix, a more elaborate appendix, as though it has extra function to us. And so Parker has offered the hypothesis, along with Randall Bollinger and a few others, that the appendix is in fact a small house for microbes in our gut, so that if we get severe gut infections, like cholera, infections that aren't very common in the developed world where our appendixes are more likely to get infected, that the bacteria can then recolonize our gut from that little house. This is a radical new idea. Nobody has written a critique of it. It could be wrong. If it's wrong, somebody go out and work on it and show that it's wrong. But nobody can say it's wrong yet. And this is our appendix, for those of us who still have them. And this was your appendix for those of you who don't. And this is very recent. And so I think there's this amazing thing that goes on where, we go out looking for giant new tigers, and yet there's something else to be discovered, some smaller thing, an unknown smaller realm that remains as wide and wonderful as it's ever been. And I think part of the problem, or one way to frame this problem, is to think about a quote I'll paraphrase from Chekhov, which is that, show me two people in a room with a teacup, and the story is always about the two people. We think about each other first, and other things look kind of like us second, and then we only come to think about the smaller things very remotely. And so Copernicus' revolution, the idea that the Earth circles rather than be circled by the sun, was relatively easy to internalize. The idea that we're marginal in the universe, we just have to look up and we can remember. But it's much harder to remember that we're marginal in the world of life, that we're marginal in terms of the living. So that even when you have two people in the room with a forehead mite, your temptation is for the story to be about the two people. But the forehead mite's pretty interesting. And so I would argue that this unknown world, as I circle through these stories, is as wide as it has ever been, that there's as much to discover as there's almost ever been, that we are ignorant. And one of the first lessons from these discoverers is that discovery needs to be preceded by the realization that even in looking at our daily lives, that something new can be discovered. And I'll wrap up with a couple more quick slides and one more quick reading. Anatomically modern humans first appeared in Africa around 200,000 years ago. For most of subsequent human history, we lived in a world defined as our moment by our immediate surroundings. We knew the visible species around us, particularly those that were deadly or delicious. Sometimes we stumbled upon a new fruit and tried it. What did not kill us probably led us to eat a little more. In the last 300 years, the Western view of the world has changed in many ways. The big discovery, I've tried to argue tonight, is that life is more diverse and less like us than we had imagined. That discovery might be called Leeuwenhoek's revolution. A few centuries of biological discovery have pushed us to the edge of life. The rest of life does not revolve around us, nor is it like us. Yet in our daily lives, we remain central. The anthropologists, when they get together, talk not about the universe, but about each other. We cannot, without repeated reminders to wake up and pay attention, live any other way. Most days you do not look at the stars, and in the same vein, it's all too easy to ignore the other life we pass by. The species on our bodies are small, and the crust of Earth is so far away. Because we focus just on those species around and like us, it makes it easy to imagine we are close to finding every domain of life, or even every species. There's nowhere to hide a new monkey, the logic goes. And so ever since we began to name those species in the communities beyond our own, we began to believe ourselves close to finding everything. Yet every time we've come close to knowing all the species, or even all the kinds of life, some new realm has been discovered. Ironically, discovering so much more about our biological world seems only to affirm our own ignorance. And that ignorance, I would argue, stems in part from the fact that we expect too much too soon. We're on this tree of life, we're this small branch, we're just another primate, we're a little smarter than the chimps, but we don't expect them to understand the universe, and somehow we expect ourselves to get it right perfectly the first time. I should say this quote here is a Linnaeus quote to indicate that our similarity to other primates was noticed much earlier than Darwin. I'll close with Peter again. So this is Peter Neskrensky as a small boy. When he was a boy, his father was an astronomer. And so he told Peter that if he wanted to find something out new about the world, to look to the stars. But Peter couldn't bear to look at the stars. He collected things. He collected lizards and snakes and everything else. He, in fact, accidentally introduced a new lizard species to Poland at the age of like 8. But all of these discoveries made by living people I've talked about today have happened since Peter was a small boy. All of these things have fundamentally changed how we see the world. And they don't just change faraway places. The archaeans that were discovered live in Peter's mouth and in his gut and in your mouth and in your gut. And we didn't even know they were a branch of life. The mitochondria are in all of us. And most of us have this appendix thing hanging around that we're not quite sure what does. And so as we shine our light, this meager light of science, out into the living world, I would just suggest that even when things start to look a little bit clearer, that you notice that most of the scene is still dark, and most of what can be known is still unknown. And with that, I'll close with a $200 bet, which is that if any of you surveyed a large group of people for their forehead mites, which most of you have, no function of being in Raleigh, something special here in the water, the odds that by genotyping forehead mites, by looking at their genetics like you could do in an intro biology class, that you would find a new species are very high. And so this unknown, it could even live on us. One of you might be the one with the strange other species of forehead mite. We've not even studied them. So if somebody wants to go for it, I got $200 on it. Of course, it'll cost more than that to do it, but there you go. But thank you very much. That's what I've got for today.